So I guess they thought that I'm suitable for this panel for some reason. So I'm here to moderate, and I would like our panelists to introduce themselves.
Okay. I'm Connie Willis. I write science fiction and have for since the late Cretaceous, basically. My newest novel is called The Road to Roswell, which is a comic novel about alien invasion. And because I always hasten to say that because I don't want anyone to think I would ever write a serious novel about aliens or about Roswell. So.
My name is John Stith. I write mainly science fiction. My novel Manhattan Transfers in development for TV now. And my latest work is a young adult trilogy called Time Ship. Parts 1, 2, 3.
Which I have read and which is very good.
I'm Arkady Martine. I write mostly science fiction, but occasional fantasy, and probably am secretly a horror writer. Just, it's everywhere. My latest book is called Rose House, which is a sort of strong AI in a haunted house, or is a haunted house book. Near future science fiction, which I learned that writing near future science fiction is really difficult, and I don't like it.
Yes, it is hard.
I'm Vivian Shaw. I write urban fantasy and science fiction. My latest novella, Bitter Waters, will be out in June or July.
You said July earlier.
July. And my short fiction has appeared in Pseudopod and Uncanny, and I have a story coming out sometime this year from the Deadlines.
Great. So when I got this panel, I thought I would ask this question: what is science to you guys, and why you are writing science fiction? Because science to me perhaps is different as a person who's in academia. So I wondered why, what's the definition for you for you, and also what makes you write sci-fi, please.
I think those are two different questions. But let's see. What drew me to science fiction as a kid was just that it was so interesting. There were so many different kinds of stories. We were talking earlier in our last panel, Arkady was talking about structure of stories versus genres, and science fiction is a genre that includes all kinds of stories, and I was so shocked when I started reading. First I started reading Heinlein's juveniles, which were great, and then a great introduction. But very quickly, I found the year's best science fiction short story collections. And that was even better because they were in there. There would be this really funny story, and then there would be this space opera, and then there would be this tragic romance. There would be this sort of what was basically a Western, only in outer space. And then there would be this interesting thought piece that didn't really have any characters or anything. And then there would be this thing where there was a sentient, I don't know, algae or frog or something. And then there would be, and every story was different. It looked like you could do practically anything at all that you wanted to. And I was so happy to find this. Now, later on, I was on a panel with Ben Bova, and we were supposed to define science fiction. By the way, that's a fool's errand. There's no way to define it. But Ben Bova said, well, my definition of science fiction is a story in which the science is in the forefront. The main character is a scientist. The science already exists in our known universe. And the point is the science. The point of the story is the science. And I said, well, that's a really interesting definition, Ben, but it excludes like 99% of all science fiction stories. And he said, I know, but it includes mine.
Oh my God.
And so I have never believed in that definition of science fiction. And I think it's somewhere closer to the year's best collections that I read than it is to Ben's stuff. He was just kidding, of course. But because I think that science plays a part in every story, but it's not always in the forefront. And sometimes it's not even in the pages of the story. It's simply implied in the background of the story because you're telling a story about the future or about space or whatever. But yeah, it's a huge wide open field, and who wouldn't want to write in this field? It's just a great field. There are restrictions every place else except in science fiction.
I enjoy reading about things we haven't experienced yet, in general. I also enjoy mysteries, but we're not yet experienced. And so when I write about things I have not yet experienced. At least I might have experienced them emotionally, but I haven't been on a space station or orbiting a black hole or whatever. And to get to many of those choices, science is involved in some level or not. And one of the, I mean, we write to be entertaining, but part of that is to be convincing. Like Connie's writing about the Blitz. She has the right amount of details that tell you that she did her research. This is a convincing portrayal of what's going on. And in science fiction works, if you're relying on the science as part of your background, you want it right. You want accurate.
I take a pretty expansive view of the kind of science that I think counts as science fiction. Because I do think there's for me, science fiction is a really, really broad category. But very often science fiction stories are about a exploration of a currently not true or currently only very slightly true type of technology that makes a change in the world, and then what would happen if. But by technology, I don't mean just like rocketry or computers or I take a sort of go back to ancient Greek, and it's technic. It's what is a learnable art. So propaganda is a technology, journalism is a technology, the printing press is a technology. And honestly, if you set a story in like the 1500s and it really was about the effects of the printing press, I'd have a hard time arguing it wasn't science fiction. Even if there were no like extra normal events that took place in it, by the definition I've set out for myself anyway. The kinds of science I'm most interested in, I guess, would fall under what we usually think of in the academy as social sciences. Where my training is, I'm a historian. I'm interested in sociology, I'm interested in society formation and how people work out how to live together or don't. And the technologies, including social technologies, that mediate those. So making them more extreme or weirder or different, that's science fiction to me.
I'm a scientist by inclination, if not by actual training. I'm the child of scientists. I grew up surrounded by it. But I think that science is basically the act of trying to find out why something works. And someone who is a scientist is always going to be trying to figure out how something works. Like, they're not just content with going, wow, that's super cool. Okay. It's like, wow, that's super cool, but what does that mean?
Right.
If I can look at how it actually came to be, what underlies it, then I can use that and extrapolate and get somewhere else with it. The science fiction to me basically involves technology in some way. Generally technology which has progressed beyond our current state of sophistication. But like you said, the Gutenberg story, I think I would also possibly just...
It's a very science fictional
story. It is. Right. And also science fiction and horror go hand in hand, absolutely. And the first short fiction I ever wrote was actually set on Venus. And it's a horror story, but it's also very clearly sci-fi. And I too read those books with the, all of the year's best short stories, and I just, like, that's how I got introduced to so many writers, so many
Right.
ideas.
Right.
And it was just like, I would dive in and not come out again until I found the end of it.
Yeah.
But science fiction is a huge broad category of discovery.
And I think that the definition of technology has to be, or of science has to be really, really broad. You cannot limit it. I wrote a story called Even the Queen, which was about a tiny technology, really little technology, and then all the effects it had on the world. And the tiny technology was that they had discovered a drug or a medical intervention that could make it so women did not have to have their period every month. They could only have it when they wished to get pregnant. The rest of the time they didn't have to deal with it. That seems really small, especially to guys. It seems small, and it's really a big deal to women. And it had, and then I was able to like really broaden out all of the, all of the implications of that and how that would affect the society, what would change and what wouldn't change. But there are several ways to write that story. You could write that story of the scientist who's discovering it and the problems he's facing, she or is facing. And then you could write it shortly after the discovery as the implications are starting to happen. Or you could do what I did, which was go 20 years past and then see what the backlash was and see what the implications of everything that had happened in the meantime, and then the responses to those things. And all of those would be science fiction stories. But to certain kinds of science fiction writers, only the first one would count as a science fiction story. The one with the scientist and the lab and the discovery. But all of them are actually science fiction, even though people can say, this isn't a science fiction story. I'm like, oh yes, it is. It definitely is.
You've introduced a technology and explored the changes that technology will. That's like the textbook. Right. I have one that I try to give away at every convention I'm at because I'm not gonna write it and it's too good to just live in my head. So take your Roman Empire, about the 2nd century AD, so during the beginning of the dissolve into like problems with generals being really far away from your central city. Give them FTL communication, give them the Ansible.
Yes.
Ooh. You can even call it Ansible, you just have to spell Sybil differently. Someone please write this so it stops living in my head. You could do it, except I'd yell at you about the research.
Well, no, you would do the research for me.
No, see, that's what I don't want to do.
It's great that everybody comment each other. Is there any more comments? So I think next question will be what she just mentioned, how you research things, So you have this science topic, right? How do you actually start to write topic of science when you write science fiction? Does it make sense even?
Well, for me, I mean, it starts in different ways. When I got the idea for Even the Queen, which by the way, was in an elevator at a Clarion West. I was in the elevator with several of my female students. And one of them was asking if anybody had any ibuprofen because she was having major cramps. And then we all agreed that if men had cramps, that the guy who invented ibuprofen would have the Nobel Prize. And that set me thinking off in other directions. And then I came up with this idea. So I started with the idea rather than the research. But that's not always the case. Other stories, I'll start with the research and then get the idea for the story. But in that case, I came up with the idea and then set out to see what was available. Had they actually come up with things like this? What was likely to be a kind of technology that would work for this sort of thing? And how much of that did I want to share? I can't speak for it. I looked up a lot more stuff than ended up in the story.
Oh, yeah.
I did a ton more research because I needed it to write the story, but it did not belong in the story. And if you put too much of your research in the story, it looks like you're forcing, your reader just gets bogged down. They don't care. And sometimes they care. And if they care, then it needs to go in. If they don't care about this aspect, then it doesn't need to go in. And you need to So it's sort of an iceberg kind of thing, it's what is it, 1/7 is above water level, and that's the only part that the reader sees. The rest of it, though, has to be done, totally has to be done. If you don't, then that people will spot the flaws in your story immediately, so. And I know you do a ton of research, don't you?
Yeah, in the old days, I used to haunt the used bookstores in the library, and I'd wind up with generally 6 to 12 books in the subject that I was interested in. Nowadays, the internet is just such a
great.
gold mine.
It is, so it is.
Trust everything there, and it doesn't answer every question, but it's sure the first place I look.
I think I both do less than most people and more than, or in a different way. Again, because I come from a social science background, and my sense of how to do research is often very holistic, that I'm doing sort of historical research, so it's like big trends and like how do societies respond to things. But that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes run into, okay, I want to put this in my story, whatever this small thing is, I have to know exactly how it works, and it's a very similar process. The kelp beer expedition, I wanted there to be beer on a self-contained space station, and it was really difficult because I knew they only had hydroponics, and I kind of knew how beer worked, but I just really wanted these characters to be able to drink beer. And it's like a sane person would have decided they could drink something more easily distilled instead, but I was not the same person.
So 300 bucks later.
Yeah, and I still got yelled at on the internet.
I start researching with Wikipedia. This is not where you should end. Use Wiki as a jumping off point.
Right.
Because Wiki will give you ideas of what you don't know, and then you can make a more focused search, and then you can drill further down, and eventually you'll get lost in the rabbit hole and go, oh shit, I should have spent like 3 hours not doing that. But now I know everything about this particular tiny little esoteric detail. But you're absolutely right about the iceberg thing. But in my novella, Helios Syndrome, which is basically practical necromancy and air crash investigation to great taste that taste great together. There's a lot about how long it would take for a plane to get from point A to point B, given various tiny little details, and I needed to find all of that information, and I needed to do so much research to make sure I understood what it was I was writing about, so that I wasn't going to get jumped on by that person, because I am often that person, so I understand the motivation. But
You're that person. This
I am
is
that person. I am that person.
Every letter. Oh
I am
my
that
God.
person.
Now we know who to
Because
blame.
I wanted to make sure that I got it right. I did all of this research, and then approximately like an 18th of that made it onto the page, because it didn't need to be there. I needed to know it, but the reader doesn't necessarily need to be told it. And that's one of the hardest things I had to learn is, yes, do the research. No, don't use everything you've learned.
Yeah. And I also think you need to go beyond the basic research to the unintended consequences, first of all. There are always unintended consequences, no matter what the technology, no matter what the science, there are always unintended consequences. And I remember a period when everybody was writing immortality stories, we're all gonna be immortal. And we're all gonna live forever. And I was like, now, there could be some problems with that. No, there won't be any problems with that. Oh, of course there will be problems with it. There will be, what makes you think there will not be any problems with this when every time we have ever had a scientific advance in the entire history of the world, there have been problems that nobody saw coming? Well, not this time. And so you have to figure out what those unintended consequences are. You also have to figure out, as when you're dealing with technology, what the technology will solve and what the technology will not solve. So my technology and even the Queen solved a lot of problems, a lot. At the same time, it did not basically change social dynamics between people. So I still have a horrible mother-in-law in this story because I personally feel that no matter what technological advances we have, there will still be horrible mother-in-laws out there. It's just like a law of nature, you know? And so you have to figure out the things that, you know, this is a great thing that has happened, but it doesn't solve everything. And you have to figure out all those implications to if you really want to get into the, you know, the science of it. I mean, so it really feels like the science of it, because that's what we deal with when we have scientific advances. We don't just have the advance. We also have all the real world consequences that happen and all the things that we didn't know that happened. So
I really love that. What does this solve and what does this doesn't solve? And I want to add a third one. What does it break?
yes, what does it ruin?
Yeah.
Right, that you did never expect it to ruin. Yeah.
Well, with the thrust onions, right? Like leaded gas, they sort of knew there were problems, but it's like, hey, look.
Yeah, right.
Unintended consequence.
I found it, I like the book, it's given to me 2 years ago. It's called Blueprint for a Battlestar, and it's the science behind some different science fi technologies, and it talks about, you know, the Death Star, and I think it talks about the DeLorean and some other things, and so it gives kind of the science side of it, but it also gives why it doesn't work now, or why it wouldn't work now in our current level of technology. And I like the, you know, thinking about that, you know, it tells you the science behind it, and also tells you why it won't work, and that might be kind of a negative, but I think it's a positive, because, okay, we know why it doesn't work, let's start thinking about how can we make it work. I like that side of it too. Yeah, but it's a good book, I like it.
Yeah, there's a series of books that, the names escape me because I'm old, that were written by a guy who was specifically looking at unintended consequences. And one of them has something about left turn signals in the title. But anyway, the example that I remember the most clearly was, there used to be, in planes, there used to be a lever that lowered the landing gear. A big lever in the compartment, and you just pulled it and it lowered the landing gear. And after World War II, they developed a way that it was being electronically lowered. So they took out the lever and they put a button on the control panel and said, we'll just have a button on the control panel. They had not realized that the purpose of the lever was to, 1, lower the landing gear, and 2, tell you that you had lowered the landing gear, because you could just see it, because you could look and the lever was in this position. Right. And they had all these plane crashes
Yes.
because the people thought they had pulled the lever and they hadn't. And they put the lever back in, even though it does virtually nothing. Except it's connected to the pan, it's connected to the thing on the panel. But now it's still there because they realized that, and that's the one I would add to yours. You added,
I had, what does it break?
what does it break? And then what other purposes did the older technology serve that now also need to be solved by the newer technology?
So there's actually a plane, the door is an automatic door has to be closed by person. For the same reason, I mean, it's a bit different reason, because if electricity fails in the plane, they crash, right?
Right.
People have to escape. So they come off the door, it has to always manual.
Right.
Yes, that's, I guess.
Right.
Why that poor woman drowned in that Tesla.
Yeah, it is why that poor woman drowned in that Tesla. Exactly.
I know.
She fell into a pond, she couldn't get out.
I know.
Because Tesla.
And, well, on the other Tesla thing, which you may not know about, is this, my daughter was just telling me, she lives in California, so she's right there. But if you look at the new Teslas, the door handles are flush
Until you come by with your key.
until you come by with your key. But the cop or the fireman trying to get you out of that car has nothing to grab hold of them. And so they're having all kinds of accidents where people can't get out of the car from the outside, as opposed to the one with the drowning, which was from the inside. Once again, didn't really think about the purposes of these things.
Well, I think it's relevant to what you're saying too, because most of the failings with Tesla at large Or it's a car designed not by car makers.
Yeah.
It's a car designed by other engineers that are trying to remake the car.
Right,
Yeah, they didn't think about human factors, what was their.
Right.
Things that
And
human-
right, yeah.
the thing that made Tesla so like revolutionary in the US car making space is to reimagine the engine and the drivetrain completely. And that's where a non-car engineer can make this kind of huge breakthrough. At the point where it becomes a ubiquitous or semi-ubiquitous car option, and I live in Santa Fe, and over the past like 2-3 years, we've gone from knowing where all of the Teslas were in Santa Fe to there being Teslas everywhere in Santa Fe.
I don't like parking.
And it's just like, okay, these are now a regular object. Does this regular object work for a regular person? Also, there's lots more of them. So the law of averages of bad things happening to one of them is now just gonna happen. Bad things are gonna happen to people in Teslas, like bad things happen.
It used to
To
happen
people
to
in
Dodge
Ford.
Darts and things.
Yes. But what kinds of things should be there and aren't? And that's that made by people who aren't car makers. Like some of these problems have been solved.
So
Right.
my next question is, I would
I
like to
just add, look,
please.
one good resource for this is a book called The Design of Everyday Things.
Thank you.
Yes.
Talks about, for instance, why there's a bar on the inside of this door where you're supposed to push. And glass doors that have bars on both sides are a bad idea,
Because,
because you both want to push.
that's right.
So this is related to what you are talking. So in science fiction, usually science is something to fight against. You know, like we have to. It's a usually evil entity. You know? But I guess there's always good things about it too. You know, but why we are what we make. I'm not sure how you portray it in your writing. About science, but I would like to talk about that. Idea why we
Good or bad?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, we started out, the first science fiction novel was Frankenstein, right? And so, unless you guys want to fight it.
That's fine.
But one of the first science fiction novels was Frankenstein, which is about not figuring out the consequences of what you were doing and not thinking it out in advance before you do it. That means rampaging through the town with and
Undergraduate.
so, as the kind of the mad scientist, science out of control, was really popular in science fiction.
It's not a problem with science, but a problem with us.
Right, the problem is the people are not thinking this through. And then there got to be, like, I'm thinking Disney in the 1950s, Mr. Science, and Mr. Atom. This is all great, and science is a positive force in our world, which is not true either. Science is completely amoral. It's good or bad, depending on how it's used. And it's good or bad, depending on whether people have thought it through clearly before they use it. And so, I think it's science is much more sophisticated as it's portrayed in science fiction now than it was. Jack Williamson used to talk about it. What a shock, because he came up writing in a period where science was looked at. He called it the golden key to the future, and it was looked as there'll be nobody that's hungry. Everybody will be beautifully housed. The world will, we won't worry about energy anymore. There'll be all these wonderful advances, which is all part of science. Everything he said came true. Disease will disappear. All those things kind of came true. And then he said when the atomic bomb came along, he said it was a psychic shock to basically every science fiction writer. They had been pushing this idea of positive science, and then they were horrified by what happened. And so then their picture of science turned much darker, and you began to get many more science as the enemy, science as a problem, science as
Meddling in God's domain.
or meddling in right.
To make enormous insect within decimate Los Angeles.
Right, exactly. So,
Which I wouldn't
but I don't think that's where we are right now. I think not in Los Angeles, just in science fiction's portrayal of science, I think is more
It's changed.
balanced at this point, and people are more, they're always aware of the problems, but they're also aware of the good things that science can bring, like, say, the eradication of polio, for instance, kind of thing. And so I think that the way science fiction portrays it, it depends on the writer, it depends on what they're trying to do, depends on, how they personally see science, I think. What is it usually positive? It's pretty positive in your stories, right?
Usually, but having it go wrong can be a
Yeah.
lot of fun.
Yeah.
In
In a story, it can be a lot of fun.
yeah, in my not-for-hire, all the low-level AIs are built on lowest bidder companies.
Oh, government
Market
contract.
first. And so they're riddled with human complexes and just they're damaged.
That's why so many of us are really uncomfortable with this AI thing. Really,
Right.
very concerned, very uneasy.
Got a lot of potential for going the wrong way.
Perhaps we should ask questions. Open
But we,
would you like to comment on? Oh, please. No?
Yeah, I did. Okay.
sorry.
All right, how do you know when you're making up a sort of critical background science for a hypothetical world, something that doesn't exist, we don't have proof that could exist? When you make that as a baseline of something, so for example, with the Expanse series, they have the Epstein drive, which was fine and dandy until I read that one novella where they talk about his creation of it. It's just this backwoods person working on a spaceship that suddenly magically figures out to make the usage of mass way, way, way more efficient. And it just didn't feel real in the way that like they were talking of the alien virus thing, whatever, they can rework anything carbon-based into other stuff did, because they didn't try to dive into the science of it or explain out something. So how do you find that boundary of, I need this science, but if I talk about it too much, then people stop believing it really makes sense and is plausible for the rest of what can go on in the universe?
So, two things. One, don't break your own rules.
Yes.
If you put it on the page and you said this is true, then it's true in your story. And if you're gonna break it, you have to prove how you can. So try not to set yourself up to have to do that. It's no fun and you have to rework your timeline. Not that I had to do that. But also I think that as a science fiction writer, you're allowed to play with technology that you don't know how it would happen. Or even if what we know now about various scientific disciplines is kind of pointing us to say this is not going to happen. I very deliberately did that in my books with the Imago machines in my text cloud novels, which are basically a kind of mind sharing. And I have a very good friend who is a neuroscientist, and I went to my friend Ben and I said, "This doesn't work. Is it coherent?" And he said, "Yes, but that's not possible. That's not how memory works." It's like, okay, that's
It's
not how memory
consistent.
works,
It's consistent.
but it's consistent. I built a thing.
Yeah.
And I'm still interested in what I would call a technological problem. I actually came up with this idea in part because I wanted to think about institutional memory, which is a real world problem. It's a problem that we often first encounter in industrial applications. How do you teach a skill that isn't in the manual? Every time someone leaves an important job, what do they take with them that's intangible? What if you could fix that problem? That was essentially what I was trying to work on. That was the idea. And is my answer plausible? No. But it does let me talk about the problem in a new and interesting way. So I would still consider that a science fictional working of the problem.
And critically in that example, you also didn't really go into much detail of how the basis of it works.
Oh,
Now there's a bit of an
no
implant in
idea.
that scale. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of the good level versus the Epstein drive where they went a little bit too much into this backyard dude just bashed some pipes on his spaceship and now it goes really fast.
Yeah.
It works
Right.
in like kids science fiction when it's like, okay, like you build a tin spaceship and the alien overnight made it into the real thing you were imagining in your mind. Great, fine. But when the rest of it's so science-based or whatever, then you suddenly do this little bit, it sort of ruins that aspect.
There's also a technique that we all use, which is called hand wavium. And that one of the masters of hand wavium was Robert Heinlein, who wrote great novels, great early science fiction novels. And I'll always remember the one, Tunnel in the Sky. And Tunnel in the Sky, they have this technology where you can go from planet to planet. You open the gate, you're here on Earth, one end of the gate is on Earth, you go through this short tunnel, and then you're on another planet somewhere. Okay, so at one point they asked, how does this work? And the character says, well, this was invented by, make up the name, George Smith. And George Smith wanted to invent time travel. And he invented this time travel machine, and when he opened the other end of it, he discovered that, yes, he was millions of years back in the late Cretaceous, this lush jungle. And he was so excited, worried, of course, about raptors and things, but still really, really excited. And he wandered around for 2 days till he came to the entrance of the Rio de Janeiro Botanic Gardens, which he had been actually lost in. And then he realized that he had not invented time travel, he had invented the gate. That's the scientific explanation. And you read it, you're real happy, and you think it's really funny and great, and you move on, and then you're like, wait, he didn't really explain this at all. Which is the secret of hand wavium. You have to do it without the reader realizing what's being done to him. But it is something we can all use. And I know, like in my time travel novels, there are different kinds of time travel novels. In some time travel novels, it's essential to know how the time travel machine works. In mine, it is not.
Yeah.
What matters is that my characters can use this to go places, and that I have the internal consistency, that there are things you can't do, there are things that don't work, you can't be in the same place at the same time twice, and you can't move forward in the future, and you can't, I have a whole list. I never break those, because and the fact that it's internally consistent then convinces people that I also know how the time travel machine works, which I don't. So, but it kind of depends, because I like Greg Benford's Timescape. It's essential to the story. It's central to the story how the time travel works. But it's not in a lot of other time travel stories.
The internal consistency thing is absolutely key, because it throws me out of the story immediately if I've been led to believe that X and Y are possible, but Z is not, and then a character just sort of blithely walks in and does Z, I'm like, you what now?
Yeah.
You couldn't do that. That doesn't know how that works.
Ghost, the movie Ghost.
The
movie Ghost.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
You can't do that.
He can't communicate. He's a ghost and he can't communicate, and then he can.
And
You're
then
like, what do you
suddenly-
mean he can?
Or maybe he can because of the power of true love or something.
Right,
It's just not-
yeah, no.
I'm the kind of person who needs,
Yeah, wrong, so wrong.
I'm so
Yes.
disappointed.
I'm the kind of person who needs to not just maintain internal consistency, but I need to come up with a whole framework, even though I don't necessarily tell anyone on the page about how it works. But I came up with a whole system of magic that is based on particle physics, basically. It took me a while, and I had to go through a bunch of versions of this, and no, that doesn't work. I've made myself into a corner. Oh, what if I did that? And then, because all of this doesn't actually ever need to be shown, but I need to know it. Because that also tells me what my characters can and cannot do within this magical world. Like what aspects of it are changing depending on what plane of reality you're on, what happens to reality when somebody does this wrong, all that stuff. But I get to do that work for me mostly. But having the rules and staying inside the rules is I think the most important thing you can do.
And that's not just true in science fiction. I mean, it's true all the way across the board in literature. But
Also in science too. I always science, when you
Right.
write science, I tell my students that you have to be consistent.
Right.
They don't think that, but.
right, yeah, and that, like in
Consistency.
fantasy, some people say, well, I write fantasy because Science has all these rules and I don't want to abide by them. Fantasy has just as many
So
rules.
many feels like it has more.
It has to, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and you absolutely have to be internally consistent all the way through.
Yeah, because you're creating the extra word.
Right.
You have to know even that you have to create language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, color of the skin, you know, all those things. What kind of food they eat.
Right.
Right.
And too, in science fiction, you're typically allowed one big idea.
Yes.
But if you, and people are, they're wanting to give you their willing suspension. I also agree that the more rickety the science is, the less you want to show that.
Just, I also appreciate, however, when authors kind of comment on the silliness sometimes of the science way. I'm thinking predominantly of Douglas Adams, where he continuously takes on new and new systems of theoretical math and theoretical physics that drive these interstellar, drives, and yet they're all silly and kind of not that far off sometimes from how some advanced theoretical math and physics can look. Like his the ship is based on bistromatics,
Yes.
just based on the anomaly of how no matter how much you try to evenly divide things up, the check never makes sense when you try to say it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's another trick you can use besides hand waving, and that's the hang a lantern on it.
Yes.
If you know this is something
Lampshade.
your reader is going to notice and point out, it may have seemed ridiculous that I was willing to do this, but and I have really no excuse for why I did, but I did it. And then you move on, because otherwise, if you don't mention it, they're gonna say, well, that's ridiculous. There's no reason on earth why she would have done that, kind of thing. So,
I think what we're kind of all talking about is you don't want the reader to think that you made a mistake.
Right.
And the reader can think that for a lot of reasons. They can think it because you weren't sufficiently rigorous. They can think it because you broke a rule. They can think it because what you did was so ridiculous it surely can't be what you meant to do. But if you can avoid showing your lack of rigor, if you can stay within your own system that you built or prove why you have to leave it, and if you can say, yes, that thing is absolutely ridiculous and I know too, so you can come with me, it's okay. The reader thinks you know what you're doing, which may or may not be true, but the reader needs to think it for the space of the book.
And then they'll go along with you, even if it just makes no sense, because it's clearly supposed to be like that, and therefore if you do it right, you can just sort of skate past.
Which is like all of Terry Pratchett.
Yes, yes,
Right.
very much.
right.
This one goes philosophical. If you write speculative science fiction, something might happen in the future, and you can put science that is plausible enough, especially near future, and then it becomes real because they actually do manage to make it work. Does that stop being science fiction and just become fiction? Or is the being of science fiction from the point at which it was written, rather than the point at which it is being looked at currently?
I would say that is a good question, and it's a tricky one, and it's why a lot of people avoid near future stories, because they don't want the truth catching up with them, either that they were wrong or that they were right, either one. I wrote a novel called Remake, and in it, CGI had completely taken over all of the human aspects of movie making, and they didn't need live actors at all anymore. When I wrote that story, the farthest we had gotten was Fred Astaire dancing with a vacuum cleaner in an ad, a very clunkily done ad. By the time I finished the book several years later, we were halfway to CGI, and now, of course, if you go read the book, you think, what's she talking about? I mean, of course, it isn't science fiction at all. This is the way things are. We're not quite to full no actor CGI, but we're getting close. And so I'm like, I should get credit for all these things I made up that turned out to be true. But it's part of the price of paying, of reading science fiction. Heinlein came up with the credit card in the 1950s. But he also thought we would not have cars, and we'd all be moving on rolling roads with like the platforms in the airport, you know, moving walkways. He was dead wrong about that. He was right about the credit card,
The
but
really weird thing is, so if you happen to be born in the 80s like I was, and reading kind of in the 90s, and think, oh, credit cards, well, that makes perfect sense, it's just called something. And
right?
like not noticing that
That
it was science fiction.
Right.
Because it just seemed like part of the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think it, to me, I don't think it doesn't make it unscientific fiction, and, you know, it's just, so when I teach something, for theory, you know, political psychology, for example, what is one of the class I'm teaching, I always give them idea of what kind of background of the history they are learning about. In that case, it makes sense within that
Right.
internal consistency, right?
Right.
So why people are crazy about computer science back in the 70s and 80s, because when it came out, people thought the human think like that. You know, before that there was behaviorism. You know, so I think we have to. I mean, I'm
right.
saying
No, it all has to, right, it all has to fit into the context, and that's the hardest, I think that's one of the hardest things. We tend as readers to, and as people, to judge the past by our standards, which you shouldn't do, because sometimes there's gonna be a future, and they're gonna be judging us, and there's no way we can tell what it is that we're doing that's an unforgivable sin right now,
I know.
you know?
It's very
So, but it is really hard, and you have to view it in the context. It's like when you go after Mark Twain in Huck Finn, for you know, and they'll say, well, he's racist. Look at this, he calls Jim a nigger, and he says this, and he does this, and you're like, it's 1855 that he's writing this book, and for the time, he's unbelievably advanced and unbelievably liberal and unbelievably ahead of his time. You cannot judge him by where we have gotten to, because we partly got there because of him. So it's the same is true of science fiction, I think. I'm sorry, didn't mean to get touched. I feel very strongly about Huckleberry Finn. Sorry.
It's a great book. It's a good
So
book.
we have one more question, right?
Yes, from you guys, I kind of got like this message that you should over research as much as you can, but only include the parts that are story relevant and that matter to the story. I wanted to ask, when you have done this extensive research into these topics that you might find fascinating, like particle research, all that stuff, is there any times where you still want to include that extra explanation just for the people who might find it fascinating as well, or is it just better to put it away?
In one of my novels, I added an appendix. So if I could put all of my extra research.
So
We're
really-
they wouldn't let me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, partly the reason people read you is they like you and they like your voice, and so if you're interested in it, they'll probably be interested in it too. It's just the overkill, you know, that I'll be reading a novel set, you know, in the Middle Ages, and it's all about dying and how they got blue dye. And I don't care. No one cares. No one cares as much, except for the person who's the dyer. Who really loves that. And they can put it in their book, but I can't put it in mine unless I need it. And for me, my research process is, okay, when I was writing a Doomsday Book, which is set in 1300s, I needed to know the basics, for which I recommend the children's books in the library, because they cover a lot of territory and not too much detail. And then you can, it's like Wikipedia, you can then move on to what you need. And then there is the scene-specific stuff. Like, I had a scene where I needed to have my time-traveling heroine interact with the priest. And I'm like, wait, I can't write this scene until I know, would the priest have ever come to the house? Would he have been in the house? Would she have gone to the church to see him? Did a young unmarried woman, was she allowed to go to the church to see? How does this work? And I had to do all this background research just to get to where I could write the scene. Then I had the real specific details, like they're getting ready to go outside in the winter. What do I put on the little kid? Does she have a cloak? Does she have mittens? The mittens made up. And those are the super, super specific stuff. But you only need those and nothing else. You don't also need to describe every single other thing in the manner. Because if you describe the mittens and the cloak and you get it right, and you have the heroine meeting the priest in the right place, and you give a few details of the part of the church they're in, the reader will think you have described it all, even though you haven't. It's called telling details.
There's a bit in my first novel, Strange Practice, where I had to do a great deal of research to figure out exactly how somebody could get from Crouch End down to, or was it somewhere in Camden Lock, directly through the sewer tunnels, where they would have to go through overlook flows, or they'd have to change tunnels, like where there were different weirs that they would have had to go through, and where the maybe dangerous parts are. And I figured it out because I have a circa 1930 main drainage map of London, and I know the sewers really well, despite having never gone down in them. And it was like a good page and a half, and I loved it, and I had to take it out because it was killing my pacing stone dead. But I mourn that, that was a lot of really good research, and I have it written down somewhere.
The Zack Snyder cut of the book.
Hmm?
Do the Zack Snyder cut of the book.
I know,
All the
right?
stuff,
Yeah.
all the
All of
extra
it's-
stuff you wanted to put in.
All the bits that got taken out.
I think there's like a little layering. It's like the things that Connie was talking about, like the big scale overview of the world, you have to do that before you can start in some ways. But where and when you do the research on the smaller things, like they're often triggered by the process of writing. And I think like how Connie just described it is exactly that. She wants the young woman protagonist to meet with a priest. This causes a research question. Similarly, we must dress the child. It causes a research question. Those are sort of individual moments. The big scale research of what does it feel like to live in the 1300s, that is the stuff you do before you get started. So you can make your reader come with you into the feeling. One of the weird and fun things about writing science fiction is that you kind of get to make up what that feeling feels like a little bit, but you do need to, it does need to be grounded somewhere. Otherwise it just feels like yet another room in an Apple store. Right. Like there's a whole genre of science fiction which takes place in Apple stores on various planets.
Right. Well, and everybody's read this or seen the television show where, my favorite was Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. She was this woman living in the frontier days, and she was a doctor, and she was, doing all these frontier things. And the attitudes were pure 1970s. And the clothes, the hair was pure 1970s, and the makeup was pure 1970s.
Yes.
And it pretended it was period, but it wasn't period. And readers are really, and viewers are very quick to pick up on that. And they just don't, you didn't do your background research that Arkady is talking about.
Even if you did it right there.
Yeah. I mean, at the end, humans are bound to, I think you mentioned earlier, subjective, we have that and we can't lose it. And I think, as you said, to some extent, readers enjoy that as long as it's consistent or you're convincing, I think. Anyway, I think we're past the time, to be honest. Because we enjoyed. And I really thank you, you guys, and including the audience
And now, another meal. This is
That video, even if like you're doing it, so I don't,